Welcome to a story buried in history, yet powerful enough to challenge everything science once believed. Today's video takes us back to 1859, where records speak of a young black boy whose intelligence stunned doctors, scholars, and scientists so much so that they openly admitted they could not explain it. This is not a legend made for drama. This story is drawn from real historical accounts that many textbooks ignored. Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because uncovering true historical data like this takes deep research, original sources, and countless hours of verification, and stories like this deserve to be told accurately. In 1859, the scientific world was shaped less by discovery and more by Ayer's deeply entrenched racial ideology. Many leading scholars in Europe and America believed intelligence was fixed, inherited, and ranked by race. These beliefs were not fringe opinions, they were mainstream, taught in universities, published in respected journals, and used by governments to justify slavery, segregation, and colonial domination. Science was presented as objective, yet it was deeply entangled with politics and power. The idea that a black child could possess exceptional intellectual ability directly threatened the foundations of this so-called scientific truth. At the center of these beliefs were pseudoscientific practices, such as phrenology and craniometry, which claimed that skull size, head shape, and facial angles determined intelligence and moral character. Measurements were manipulated to support predetermined conclusions, always placing people of African descent at the bottom of the intellectual hierarchy. These methods were less about observation and more about confirmation, confirming what society already wanted to believe. Once labeled scientific, these ideas became nearly impossible to challenge, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Education systems in 1859 reflected the same mindset. Black children, whether enslaved or free, were systematically denied access to learning. It was widely argued that advanced education would confuse or mentally harm them. Literacy itself was often criminalized. The prevailing belief was that black minds were suited only for physical labor, not abstract reasoning, mathematics, philosophy, or scientific thought. Any display of intellectual curiosity was viewed with suspicion rather than encouragement. Medical professionals and scientists reinforced these views through biased observation. When black individuals demonstrated intelligence, it was often explained away as imitation, coincidence, or manipulation by white instructors. Genuine intellectual achievement was rarely credited to innate ability. Instead of revising flawed theories, scientists chose to protect them by dismissing contradictory evidence. Science in this era functioned as a gatekeeper, deciding not what was true, but what was acceptable to believe. It was within this rigid and hostile intellectual environment that the emergence of a very young black boy displaying extraordinary genius became profoundly disruptive. His abilities did not merely surprise observers, they undermined the very framework upon which racial science was built. In a time when science claimed to have all the answers, his mind presented a question it could not explain, setting the stage for confusion, denial, and quiet fear among those who believed their theories were unbreakable. The boy was born in 1859 as a year heavy with tension, inequality, and rigid social order. Records from the period describe his arrival as unremarkable, No titles, no privileges, no protection of status. He was born into a world that had already decided his limits before he could speak, walk, or think. In an era when black children were rarely documented beyond ownership or labor value, even the fact that fragments of his early life were recorded suggests that something about him quickly stood out. His birth took place under conditions where survival itself was uncertain and opportunity was almost non-existent. From his earliest days, caretakers noticed behaviors that felt unusual for an infant. He showed an intense alertness, responding to sounds and patterns with a focus that unsettled those around him. Unlike other children, he did not merely react. He appeared to observe. Accounts describe how he would fixate on spoken words, rhythms, and movements, as if trying to decode meaning long before language was formally learned. What might have been celebrated in another child was instead met with quiet unease, because it did not align with what society believed a black child was capable of. As he grew, these differences became impossible to ignore. By an age when most children struggled with basic speech, he demonstrated an advanced understanding of language, recalling words after hearing them only once. He asked questions that reflected logic rather than mimicry, often connecting ideas in ways that surprised adults. People who interacted with him noted that he seemed to learn without being taught, absorbing information from his surroundings effortlessly. This was not rote repetition, it was comprehension. His environment offered no formal education, yet his mind appeared to build its own. He listened to conversations not meant for him and later repeated complex ideas with clarity. Numbers, sequences, and patterns came naturally to him. Even though he had never been instructed in mathematics, those who observed him struggled to explain how such abilities could develop in conditions designed to suppress curiosity. The contradiction was disturbing, a brilliant mind emerging where ignorance was expected. By the time he reached early childhood, whispers began to spread. Some spoke of him in awe, others in fear. His intelligence did not fit the narrative of the time, and that made people uncomfortable. Rather than being nurtured, his early life became one of observation and scrutiny. He was no longer just a child, he was becoming a problem that society, science, and belief systems were not prepared to face. From an early age, the boy displayed a level of intellectual ability that far surpassed what anyone could reasonably expect from a child, let alone a black child, in the oppressive context of 1859. Observers repeatedly noted his astonishing memory, recalling events, names, and details with perfect accuracy after hearing them only once. This was not mere rote learning. He demonstrated comprehension, reasoning, and the ability to connect ideas in ways that startled those who watched him. In a society that expected intellectual inferiority, his natural genius became impossible to ignore. His mathematical intuition was equally remarkable. While other children were just beginning to grasp counting and basic arithmetic, he could perform calculations mentally with speed and accuracy that even trained adults found impressive. Some records suggest he understood concepts that were usually taught much later in formal schooling, such as fractions, geometry, and even the early principles of algebra. These abilities seemed innate rather than learned, as he had no formal teacher guiding him through these complex subjects. Language was another area where his brilliance shone. He could read fluently at an age when most children were still struggling with letters, and he quickly expanded his vocabulary to include sophisticated words and concepts far beyond his peers. He had an intuitive grasp of grammar and syntax, and could construct arguments and explanations that reflected critical thinking rather than memorization. Adults who heard him speak often reported feeling simultaneously amazed and unsettled as his intellect challenged their assumptions about intelligence and race. His abilities were not limited to academics. The boy demonstrated extraordinary curiosity and creativity, exploring questions that even adults found difficult to answer. He asked profound questions about the natural world, human behavior, and abstract ideas. In some accounts, he devised clever solutions to practical problems, showing a capacity for both logical reasoning and innovation. These qualities made him not only precocious but genuinely unique, a child whose mind operated on a level that defied contemporary understanding. Finally, his talents created a mixture of fascination, fear, and admiration among those who observed him. Some scholars and medical professionals attempted to study him rigorously, hoping to understand or document his abilities, but quickly admitted they could not explain them using the scientific knowledge of the time. The boy's early intellectual achievements were so extraordinary that they shattered the expectations of an entire society, forcing even skeptics to acknowledge the undeniable brilliance of his young mind. His abilities were a silent, yet powerful, challenge to the prejudiced beliefs that govern 19th century science and society. As the boy's extraordinary abilities became widely known, a variety of individuals, scientists, educators, and even opportunists, sought to study, control, or exploit his intellect. In a society obsessed with categorization and authority, his mind was seen not only as fascinating, but as a resource to be harnessed. Some believed that by analyzing his abilities, they could uncover the secrets of intelligence and apply them to reinforce their own power or understanding. Others saw a financial opportunity, imagining exhibitions, demonstrations, or written accounts that could be monetized. Formal attempts to study him were rigorous but often intrusive. Scholars and doctors insisted on repeated examinations, tests, and observations, trying to map the limits of his abilities. Yet these studies were rarely neutral. Their aim was not purely to understand, but to fit him into pre-existing frameworks of racial hierarchy. Observers often manipulated conditions to provoke failure or look for explanations that aligned with their biases. Yet the boy's brilliance persisted. Each attempt to control or categorize him highlighted the conflict between his natural genius and society's desire for predictability. Beyond academic study, there were efforts to exploit his abilities for social and economic gain. Some suggested placing him in institutions or public demonstrations to showcase his intelligence, capitalizing on the fascination and curiosity he generated. Others considered him a potential prodigy for specialized teaching, intended to mold him into a tool for validation of certain theories or as a spectacle to impress influential audiences. These attempts often ignored his well-being, focusing solely on the advantages he could provide to others. Despite the pressure, the boy's intellect could not be confined or fully controlled. He remained independent in thought, continually surprising observers with solutions, ideas, and insights that no one anticipated. His resistance to being tamed intellectually frustrated many who sought to exploit him. This tension between society's attempts to dominate him and his own natural curiosity underscores a critical theme: genius cannot be confined by prejudice, authority, or expectation, even in a world determined to impose limits. Ultimately, these attempts at study and exploitation illuminate not only the boy's extraordinary abilities, but also the societal anxieties they provoked. His intelligence was a challenge to established norms, a threat to entrenched hierarchies, and a revelation of human potential unbound by race or circumstance. The very efforts to contain him highlighted his exceptional independence and the limitations of those trying to understand him, leaving an indelible mark on both scientific inquiry and social perception in that era. Despite the boy's extraordinary abilities and the astonishment they caused, history did not preserve his story with the recognition it deserved. In 1859, records of black individuals, particularly children, were often incomplete, biased, or entirely absent from official accounts. While some journals, letters, and eyewitness accounts documented his intelligence, these sources were fragmented and scattered, leaving historians with only glimpses of a story that challenged prevailing assumptions. Over time, this lack of consistent documentation allowed society to erase or silence a narrative that was inconvenient to dominant ideologies. The societal biases of the era played a key role in this erasure. Institutions of science, education, and media were overwhelmingly controlled by white men who were invested in maintaining the narrative of racial hierarchy. A black child who exhibited intelligence beyond what they considered possible posed a threat to their authority and credibility. As a result, even those who witnessed his genius often downplayed or omitted his story from official publications, ensuring that the broader public, unaware of his existence. In effect, silence became a tool to preserve social and scientific orthodoxy. Historical records that did survive were frequently distorted or misinterpreted. Accounts of his abilities were sometimes framed as anomalies, curiosities, or even supernatural phenomena, rather than legitimate evidence of human potential. By casting him as an outlier, historians and writers were able to acknowledge his existence without challenging systemic prejudices. Over decades, as textbooks and scientific literature relied on these filtered interpretations, the boy's story faded into obscurity, overshadowed by narratives that reinforced racial stereotypes instead of confronting them. Additionally, the boy's lack of access to formal education and social privilege made it difficult for him to leave his own voice in history. Unlike children from affluent or white families who might have had opportunities to publish, lecture, or be publicly celebrated, he remained largely dependent on observers for any historical record. This structural disadvantage contributed to the eventual silencing of his legacy, making it almost as if his extraordinary talents had never existed in the eyes of mainstream history. Yet, despite the efforts to erase him, fragments of his story endured in letters, journals, and oral accounts, waiting to be rediscovered. Modern historians and researchers who dig into these overlooked sources are gradually bringing his life and genius back into the light. The very fact that his story challenges 19th century scientific assumptions makes it all the more powerful today. His life reminds us that history is not neutral. What survives, what is recorded, and what is forgotten often reflects the biases of those in power, rather than the truth of human potential. The story of this extraordinary boy offers a powerful lesson about the nature of intelligence itself. It demonstrates that brilliance cannot be measured, predicted, or confined by superficial characteristics such as race, age, or social status. In 1859, society attempted to define intelligence in rigid, biased terms, but his existence shattered those assumptions. His mind functioned independently of prejudice, proving that human potential is far more complex, nuanced, and diverse than any theory or stereotype could capture. This serves as a timeless reminder that true intelligence transcends societal expectations. The case also exposes the profound dangers of linking race with mental capability. For centuries, pseudoscience was used to justify oppression, slavery, and inequality by claiming inherent intellectual inferiority among black people. The boy's story directly challenges this false narrative, showing that such beliefs were not only morally wrong, but scientifically baseless. His life stands as a testament to the fact that race is not a determinant of intellect, and that prejudice often obscures our understanding of human potential rather than revealing it. Moreover, his story highlights the limitations of 19th century science and the risks of intellectual arrogance. Scientists who encountered him were forced to admit that their models, tests, and assumptions were inadequate to explain reality. This humility, though rarely expressed publicly at the time, underscores an essential principle: knowledge must be rooted in observation and truth, not ideology or bias. The boy's existence was a living challenge to the authority of flawed systems of thought, showing that facts cannot always be constrained by preconceived beliefs. Beyond science, the narrative has a broader social and philosophical implication. It reminds us that human potential can flourish even under the harshest conditions, and that society often fails to recognize or nurture talent when it arises outside expected norms. By silencing or minimizing his achievements, history attempted to preserve comfort and ideology over truth. Yet the very effort to erase him confirms the significance of his abilities. Extraordinary minds are often those that make others uncomfortable precisely because they reveal inconvenient truths. Ultimately, the boy's life teaches us a lesson about the enduring power of truth and the universality of human potential. Intelligence cannot be bound by prejudice, and brilliance will emerge even in worlds designed to suppress it. His story challenges us to reconsider assumptions, question systemic bias, and value the inherent capabilities of every individual. In remembering him today, we honor not only his genius, but also the timeless principle that knowledge and ability belong to no race, and truth will always demand recognition. When word of the boy's extraordinary abilities reached the medical and scientific communities, some professionals demanded to examine him. They approached these examinations with the expectation of confirming racial stereotypes, fully believing that any intelligence he displayed would have to be the result of trickery, tutoring, or luck. What they found, however, completely upended their assumptions. Doctors observed a child whose mental faculties operated far beyond his physical age, leaving them bewildered and at times openly confounded. Even the most rigorous tests of memory, reasoning, and problem-solving failed to produce explanations that fit within contemporary medical theory. The examinations often included a combination of observation, questioning, and practical challenges designed to measure intellect according to the standards of the time. Physicians recorded how he could solve complex problems instantly, recite information with perfect clarity, and apply logic in ways that seemed almost unnatural. Unlike adults with formal training, his knowledge appeared self-taught and intuitive. This distinction was critical. It suggested that his genius was inherent rather than cultivated by human instruction, a concept that many doctors were psychologically unprepared to accept. Some accounts suggest that these professionals attempted to measure his physical brain, following the era's obsession with craniology and phrenology. They scrutinized the shape, size, and contours of his skull, looking for markers that supposedly correlated with intelligence. Yet no conventional measures could account for the boy's abilities. His mental acuity seemed disconnected from physical expectation, further challenging the pseudoscientific beliefs that intelligence could be predicted or explained by anatomical features. Beyond intellectual testing, some medical observers also assessed his physical health and neurological responses. They were struck by the clarity of his thought, the precision of his speech, and his ability to focus intensely on abstract concepts. Even under scrutiny and repeated testing, his performance remained consistent and impressive. These consistent demonstrations of mental prowess forced even skeptical physicians to acknowledge something extraordinary was happening, something that defied the accepted scientific norms of 1859. Ultimately, the medical examinations that were intended to validate prevailing prejudices ended up documenting a mystery that science could not explain. Instead of confirming inferiority, the boy's intellect became undeniable proof that the rigid theories of racial hierarchy were deeply flawed. The reactions of these trained professionals, astonishment, confusion, and reluctant admiration, highlighted a profound truth. Human intelligence cannot be constrained by social expectation, and even the most authoritative systems of knowledge can be upended by an extraordinary individual. As the boy's extraordinary abilities became impossible to ignore, even the most confident scientists of the time were forced to admit their inability to explain him. These were professionals trained to observe, measure, and categorize human intellect according to the accepted theories of 1859. Yet here was a child whose brilliance defied every model they had constructed. Journals and letters from the period reflect a mixture of awe and frustration. Scientists acknowledged the limits of their understanding while struggling to reconcile their long-held assumptions about race, intelligence, and human potential. Many scholars initially attempted to rationalize his abilities by attributing them to external factors. Some claimed he must have received secret tutoring, while others argued that his apparent genius was a fluke, a temporary anomaly that would fade with time. These explanations, however, quickly proved insufficient. Every test, every observation, and every interaction reinforced the undeniable reality. This child's mind was operating at a level far beyond what conventional science could account for. It was not just a rare talent. It was a phenomenon that undermined the very framework of intellectual hierarchy. In private writings, some scientists confessed that their theoretical models were inadequate. They admitted that intelligence, as they understood it, could not be fully measured or predicted, especially when confronted with such extraordinary cases. For a generation trained to quantify mental capacity, this admission was revolutionary and deeply unsettling. It forced a quiet reevaluation of the biases that had long guided scientific inquiry, revealing that theories based on prejudice were not merely flawed, but dangerously misleading. This inability to explain the boy's mind created a tension between professional pride and empirical observation. On one hand, scientists wanted to maintain authority, insisting that every human trait should be measurable and predictable. On the other hand, their encounters with the boy proved that intelligence could not be fully controlled, constrained, or categorized. Their notes reveal repeated attempts to document, define, and classify him, yet each attempt ultimately failed, leaving them with more questions than answers. The case became a silent indictment of the intellectual arrogance of the era. Here was a child whose genius could not be rationalized, diminished, or dismissed. Scientists' acknowledgement of their failure to explain him not only highlighted the limitations of contemporary science, but also served as an early challenge to the racial assumptions underpinning society. In admitting their confusion, they inadvertently validated a truth that many refused to see: brilliance knows no race, and extraordinary talent can emerge even in the most hostile and constrained environments. News of the boy's extraordinary abilities quickly spread beyond the scientific community, capturing the attention of the general public. In 1859, when racial prejudices were deeply entrenched, the idea of a black child demonstrating such intelligence was almost unthinkable. People reacted with a mix of disbelief, fear, and fascination, struggling to reconcile what they thought they knew about race with the undeniable reality before them. Newspapers, letters, and anecdotal accounts revealed that many spectators were both captivated and unsettled by his presence, unsure how to categorize such an anomaly. For some, his abilities inspired awe. People who witnessed his talents firsthand described feeling as though they were observing something miraculous. They marveled at his memory, reasoning, and language skills, often comparing him favorably to trained scholars or adults of their own race. In a society where black individuals were routinely denied education or intellectual recognition, the boy's brilliance was a shocking challenge to social norms. Admirers saw in him the potential to rewrite assumptions about intelligence and human potential, even if only quietly, in private conversation or careful journal entries. Yet alongside fascination came fear and suspicion. Many could not accept that such intellect could exist naturally in a black child, and some speculated that there must be deceit or manipulation involved. Rumors circulated that he had been secretly taught by white tutors, or that his abilities were somehow supernatural. This fear was not just intellectual, it was social and political. The boy's genius threatened the widely held belief in racial hierarchy, a cornerstone of societal control at the time. His existence forced people to confront uncomfortable questions about equality and human capability. Public gatherings to observe him often drew crowds, but these encounters could be tense. Observers were simultaneously curious and anxious, unsure whether to celebrate or fear what they were seeing. Some reports suggest that adults questioned whether he should be allowed to continue displaying his talents publicly, fearing the implications for existing power structures. Even casual encounters revealed a mix of admiration and unease, highlighting how deeply societal prejudice influenced perceptions of intelligence. Ultimately, the public reaction to the boy was a mirror reflecting the contradictions of 1859 society. His brilliance elicited admiration, doubt, and quiet fear, illustrating both the limits of contemporary understanding and the power of extraordinary talent to disrupt established norms. Where people expected ignorance, they found genius. Where they expected conformity, they found individuality. The reactions of the public, like those of scientists, revealed a society unprepared to recognize and embrace intelligence when it appeared outside the bounds of prejudice.